Imperator Rome has got some big problems. The game has come stumbling out the gate onto Steam, and is currently sitting at less than 45% in user review score. In the eyes of many players, the game has not lived up to expectations of the studio's previous pedigree, and for some players, it's riddled with technical issues. I want everyone to know my position on this game and my relation with Paradox before we get into the review. I was sent this game about 3 months ago by Paradox to work on sponsored content with them. The sponsorship ended halfway through and my access to the game was revoked after I broke my embargo by saying that the game was very similar to Europa Universalis Rome and probably a few other things along those lines in my Discord. Now, I had said the game was similar to EU Rome before I got the game, so I didn't really think it was much of an issue to kind of reiterate that after I got the game, but it clearly was, and I kind of agree with them, so I have no hard feelings towards Paradox for that. So I just thought I should mention that because no doubt, if I give a good review, people will say, well, he was sponsored, and if I give a bad review, people will say, well, he's just bitter that he doesn't have the sponsorship or something like that. I just want people to know that hopefully you can just trust me when I say that I'm honestly not really being influenced by any of that stuff. I don't care. I'm just reviewing the game as is. So hopefully you can trust me in giving an honest review. So again, for clarity, I've bought my own copy of Imperator Rome, and I've got about 250 hours in the pre-release version and about 50 in the post-release version. So I'm going to go over the best and worst aspects of this game, and toward the end, I'll summarize if I think it's worth playing if you're new to Paradox, maybe if you're a recent Paradox player, or if you're a veteran of all their games. So for people really out of the loop, Imperator Rome is a grand strategy game that takes place in the year 304 BC, 18 years after the death of Alexander the Great. It's a game focused on a map of Europe and a part of Asia, extending from the British Isles all the way to India, and you're able to play as any of the 400 countries in between. You play as your chosen country, and you take the perspective of the ruler in power at the time. You've no allegiance to a particular family. Any family and any character can be in power, but when they are, that is who you're supposed to be playing as. So in many ways, people see this as a mix between Europa Universalis, where you play as a nation, and Crusader Kings, where you play as a family. However, this game does not combine the two features from both. It instead just takes elements from both, so empires aren't quite as in-depth to build up, and characters aren't quite as in-depth to interact with. On top of that, it adds its own trade resource system and pop system, but to those who might be thinking, oh, maybe it's like Victoria or Stellaris, it's not. It is again a much simplified version of goods management and pops. One of the reasons I think people are upset with this game right now is because I don't think there is one standout feature in the game that hasn't been done better in another Paradox title, and if you go far enough back into Paradox's library, you'll find Europa Universalis Rome, which is extremely similar to this game. How all of these following features work is basically the same. The trade goods, characters, pops, barbarians, colonization, religion, republics, diplomacy, war, and even the UI is very similar. This is basically a sequel, but even as a sequel it doesn't iterate that much. It's almost a straight remake. So it's a broad game. It's got a lot from other Paradox titles, but it's got a little less depth to each feature. So who's it for then? If the CK2 crowd aren't going to get their character fix and the EU crowd can't get their complex historical events and their nation building, who's the game for? New people to Paradox? Well, it's got a pretty bad UI and tutorial, so it doesn't really make learning the game easy, and even after you've learned it, it doesn't make using the mechanics rewarding. But I have got 300 hours in it, and there was not a gun held to my head to play it. I kept playing because I wanted to. The more I played, the more I did get frustrated and I felt things were missing, but it was still kind of fun to play, and it was still satisfying to grow and expand. I like my characters, I got to know them. I had some fun wars, and I enjoyed being in this world. I am a big fan of Roman history, that is my bias, specifically the Roman Republic as well. And I like strategy sandbox games. I don't really like seeing the same things happen because of events or focus trees and things like that. My bias towards this era has no doubt been the main contributing factor into me enjoying the game as much as I have, and its sandbox nature. Now, if you're a Romophile, then this is probably one of the best Rome games out there, as there just really aren't that many, but if you're not, this game probably doesn't really do much for you. So, let's tackle the big issues. The first one to me is lack of personality. On your first playthrough, you won't really notice this, but essentially there are only 3 playstyles: republics, monarchies, and tribes. Now, for instance, all republics behave the same. Whether you're Rome or Athens or even Carthage, your republic government works the same. There's 8 positions, they all do the same thing, there's 5 parties, they all function the same, how you get people into office is the same, The only things that may differ are the ideas, and the available ideas you can choose are the same for everyone, but you have a kind of a buff if you choose the ones that suit your government. You don't have to. Now, dual rulers is coming in a patch eventually to allow Rome to implement 2 consuls, but I'm reviewing what's here right now and what I've played extensively. I'll cover the patch when it happens, so as of right now, Rome's political system shares no difference to Carthage or to Athens, or other than some buffs. And sure, the buffs with laws and ideas are probably a little bit more important to min-maxers, but how you play and interact with politics will feel the exact same. You move from one country to the other, and you don't have to learn anything new. That's a problem. This is doubly true for all the monarchs and tribes. They make up far more governments in the game, making playing different barbarians or Greeks extremely repetitive. The Mauryaans and the Seleucids, vastly different cultures, they have the exact same governments. It just seems wrong, and even if it's not historically, it's definitely boring. Now, of course, I wouldn't expect all 400 countries to have unique playstyles, but like I said, there is only 3 in the game. I would expect that some of the most acclaimed historical countries would have a bit more to them to reflect both history and just to make the game a bit more interesting. Now, when you combine this with the fact that there's only 4 buildings in the game, and all nations share those 4 buildings, again, you're limiting the unique feel of a playthrough, and as well as that, all units are the same. They're kind of like base units. There's no hastati or triarii, just heavy infantry. 1 unit of Greek heavy infantry is the same as 1 unit of Roman heavy infantry, but then buffs will change how they perform over time. Now, there are traditions, which are different for cultures, that then alter the buffs of those units, and while they are good in general, I do wish they came with unique tactics options and far more army abilities. Diverse capabilities in combat is needed when everyone is just fielding modifiers on base units. Romans should be able to build siege fortifications, Iberians could maybe do more guerrilla warfare stuff, Greeks could have unique tactics with phalanx or something like that. Just something. Spend military power to do it or not, leave it alone. Options would be nice because right now there's only 1 or 2 max between different cultures and a lot of it is, shared between them. So that's pretty much my first point, and it's a pretty major one, that multiple playthroughs get old kind of fast. Countries don't have that many unique objectives or goals. Usually they have 1 or maybe 2 decisions to enact that you can kind of work towards, but often they'll just share the same kind of decisions across countries. Form an empire, form Alexander's empire, or whatever it may be. So the biggest difference to starting in another country is usually, hey, I'm in a different place. Ooh, I'm a different size. And that is it. Everything else feels the same. The next topic I want to touch on is mana. Again, this is being changed slightly in the future, but we're going to talk about how it works right now. There's 4 abstract resources in the game, commonly referred to as mana. In the game, they're called power resources. These resources tick up over time: military, civic, oratory, and religion. They tick up over time based on the skills of your ruler, and they really represent his or her ability to get things done. There are 4 skill categories for rulers that match the power resources, so one goal of character management is to typically get a good ruler into power, as that way you'll have more income for these power resources. These resources are way overly used in the game, in my opinion. To take an example, oratory power is needed for almost everything. You want to change your governor's policies, do a number of diplomatic actions, change your ideas, change your laws, promote your pops, assimilate pops' culture, and do about 90% of character actions. Even bribing a character doesn't cost gold, it costs oratory power. I guess you could call it convince rather than bribe. So, what's the issue with this? The problem is that it's really unrewarding to use because it's an instant payoff. You didn't really do anything to earn it, and spending it will instantly fix a problem. Couple that with the fact that it's needed for about 80% of the gameplay, and you'll find yourself staring at those numbers waiting for them to increase because you can't do much to influence them. And then once you do get them, you just click your problems away. This aspect of the game is something that worries me the most. I can appreciate the need for it for inter-character relations, as an abstraction of resources probably is needed there, and maybe religion as well. But I hope, really hope, that it can be phased out when it comes to empire management, because it just doesn't feel right. In a game like Stellaris, every resource, barring influence, has a material purpose and is something that you can invest into with buildings and things like that. It allows you to form a long-term plan of where you want to focus your efforts. In Imperator Rome, your ruler's randomized skills decide that for you, and if he randomly falls ill or has random events happen, his skills can be diminished and your income will be affected. There's no way to remove your ruler or dethrone them once they're in power, so you literally have to wait out the clock. This also creates situations where you're going to refuse to treat your own ruler for sickness because you just want the next one in line. Now, for a game where you're in the perspective of that ruler, that doesn't make any sense. The only way mana can ever be fixed is if it's largely removed, but it's so paramount to the game design, factoring into almost everything, I'm not sure this is ever going to be achieved. So I've mentioned empire building a lot, and now we're going to tackle that matter head on. First, it's important to note the names of things. The smallest unit of land is called a city. A city is then within a province, and a province is within a region. Now, a city has 4 potential buildings loosely tied to the 4 pop types: commerce, manpower, defense, and growth. That's the same for all nations. These buildings, barring the defense one, give you little buffs to the output of your pops and growth. They're like 1-to-1 with those pops. The more pops you have, the more buildings you can build. On its own, a building will never give you much, but at scale, it will start to build up a lot. So in a way, it's more like putting in skill points or development points into your cities rather than actual buildings. So moving on up to the province level, we have governor policies and trade. These will blanket affect the output of all that's within a province. For some reason, there's no province summary to see how much a province earns or the total unrest or all the buildings of the cities, so you have to click around to each city to see what you've built and where and how it's all working, but we'll get to the UI a bit later. And moving up another level, we have regions, and this is where governors are assigned. You don't have any other interaction with a region other than placing a governor there. The policies from the governor are a per province deal, so there's really not that much you do with regions other than just assigning a governor. So that's the scale of your building. You can only build 4 types within a city, and that's it. Pops do make your cities a bit more interesting, as they have their own culture, their own religion and class. But if they've been converted, you largely just need to leave them alone. There's no sanitation, there's no sickness, food production, temples, admin buildings, anything like that. So again, building things is pretty dull and just lacks variety, flavor, and anything unique to the culture you're in. Now at large scale, mostly because of the UI, you'll just blanket drop a bunch of buildings at once and not really care. It's probably the most unrewarding building system I've ever played in a strategy game, to be honest, and I'm looking to mod it myself. Shout out to any modders out there, drop me a line in Discord, as I've made some progress, but I'm trying to get help on a few things. Anyway, it's not all bad though. Province management does have some fun aspects. Keeping governors loyal, getting the trade goods you want, and using policies can feel pretty rewarding to have it working efficiently. When you first move into a rebellious, culturally divided area, it is fun working out what you need to do to cheaply and effectively integrate them. You can be boring and just convert it with mana instantly if you have it, but if you don't, then you can use policies, you can use standing armies, good governors, and granaries. If you match your governor's culture with theirs, it'll go a bit quicker. You know, if you get the right goods, they'll be happier. There's fun to be had with province management, but the city and the region management, those two need work, and the UI has to help manage that at scale. Now this moves us on to trade, which is part of province management. Trade is a pretty simple affair. A province will have a certain number of trade routes, usually very few. Typically, most trade is done at your capital because surplus goods at your capital provide pretty large national buffs, so it's definitely worth doing. Over time, you'll get more trade opportunities in other provinces, so you can invest in making them better, but it's not nearly as powerful as the capital. Trading between nations starts to fall down a bit because of its simplicity. Trade goods don't travel on routes, they just arrive instantly. This means they cannot be interrupted during war by blockading ports or cutting off territories. So in a sense, they're just not very strategic. Ports don't even do anything, they just provide a 10% buff to commerce to income there. I mean, that's where you make ships, I guess, but trade-wise, they don't do anything. So trade is just an instant, abstract agreement between countries that allows you to mass produce whatever it is you're trading. Further to that, the value of a good is based on the citizens in the province it comes from. Citizens are the guys that generate commerce, so I can see where they're going with it, but it's crazy because it doesn't matter if it's gold, cloth, wood, pieces of shit. It doesn't matter. Its value is the same. It's just like, oh, we're trading something, and that gives you the value. It doesn't matter what the good is. Because of that, trade amounts to just getting global buffs in exports and global buffs in your capital, and because it's instant, it again feels very unrewarding to do. It's less trade and more just a diplomatic agreement to get a certain buff. The next thing to mention is characters. Characters are my favorite part of the game. I personally really like the portrait generator. I think people often look different and look quite good, and how they age over time very gradually is great. You know, they look different based on the culture, they wear different stuff based on culture, they change their outfits depending on their job and their position. They also have a good amount of interesting traits. They have personal goals, wealth, fame, loyalty. They sit within families. They can make friends and rivals and all sorts. Now, it's not as deep as CK2's character management, and it's worth mentioning, like, I think they look good, but I have had people say that they don't like the look of characters. I guess that is quite subjective. I think they look really good. And I think characters are still fun and very recognizable to work with. Now, I do think more is needed here, but characters are probably, for me, the strongest aspect of the game. Right now, though, who you marry doesn't matter. There's no way to track a character's family history. Friendships and rivalries are largely irrelevant, and there's quite a limited amount of interactions. Now, that sounds kind of bad, but what is there, like I said, is really good. I've had characters come from the army and work their way up to be ruler. I've had tough sibling rivalry when secession came about and plots to take each other out. Events that discuss scandals and weird dilemmas. They're all really fun, and the game could do with having much more, as I feel like I'm already starting to see a lot of them over and over. The more of those, the better in my mind, and they seem like they're quite quick and easy to make. I think generally, from a gameplay point of view, it's fairly easy to stay on top of characters' loyalty, but as you grow and get more and more of these characters, the challenge does increase to keep everyone loyal as your mana powers become more limited to spend to fix everything. Now, for me, it's still pretty manageable. Once you get to know the systems, I find it very hard to have a civil war, so some balancing probably needs to be done with maintaining those relationships, but I can appreciate that's a pretty tough problem to solve. Onto what in my opinion is the worst aspect of the game, and that is the UI and the onboarding of new players. Generally speaking, I think most UI tabs are fine. The government, the overview, the religion, characters, and mercenaries, they're all fine. They look nice and they display a good amount of stuff clearly, but a lot of them are also missing really vital pieces of information. As mentioned, there's no way to see income and buildings at the province level. There's no family trees to see lineages across families. The family screen has no way of sorting it, and it isn't displayed based on prominence, wealth, name, or anything really. I think it's just who was added latest. The trade screen isn't sorted by its good types, wealth, provinces, or anything else either, and it also cannot be sorted. Moving pops in cities will display a little panel with cities in it randomly each time, and there's just a really low amount of art compared to a game like Stellaris, which had animated portraits and backdrops that made planets and locations feel distinct. Here it's just walls of text. Now, I know people are going to be saying, oh, Stellaris has like sci-fi, so it has so much more art. No, not really. I mean, even just Earth and human races have all these different ethnicities, clothes and things. Even just the human portraits. There's nothing like that in Imperator, really. So, you know, it could definitely do with some more art, and then also more distinct art for locations would feel good as well. Just break up the UI a bit more. Now, what's really bad is the tooltips and messaging systems. Starting with tooltips, it looks like programmer text with no real formatting or panels to break it up. Take this for instance. If you want to become a dictatorship in Rome, you need to enact the decision. Seeing what will happen by hovering over it displays a tooltip of some icons. Now, this is a huge event in game to perform, and it cannot be easily undone. It takes a lot to work up to this kind of stage, so it's a big moment for you, and there's just no way of knowing why you would want to do it unless you've seen these icons elsewhere before. Now, I've played for a long enough time that I've got a pretty strong guess of what they are, but if it's your first campaign, you might look at that for a very long time before you can figure out what you get. It's not like these icons are everywhere. These are very obscure, very specific icons that's not easy to find in the UI, so you can kind of double back and see what it was. You shouldn't have to do that anyway, but even in that regard, it's difficult. So for those interested, you get extra tyranny per month. That's a tyranny symbol with a per month kind of symbol attached to it. There's 15 citizen output. That's a citizen symbol with, I think, the research and the money, commerce symbols next to them. 10% freeman happiness, and then 30% civilization value. I mean, if that's not obvious, then I don't know what is. Now, these types of tooltips, they're everywhere, and they're really hard to recognize, and they're just straight up ugly to look at. I mean, green on black, gray on black, and the chosen font is kind of, honestly, it's just like an eyesore almost all the time. Often the tooltip window opens with a huge lump of blank space because of the formatting, and there's never any dividers or paneling. It's just this like black marble texture. It's really bad. The message delivery system is just awful as well. It's just a little wall of text, and no matter what it is, war declared, trade offered, trade denied, military access or whatever, it's so bad and often missing very important information. When you get a trade message from someone, it asks someone is requesting something from some place, and it says what it will give you and the amount. But to know where that is, you have to then pause the game, search where they are, look at their government, see if there's someone worth helping or not, and so on. Most of the time, it doesn't matter, but sometimes it really does. But if you just made a tooltip that showed more info and added a bit of flavor text and things like that, it'd be far better in my opinion. I mean, in a little feedback email I sent Paradox a few months ago, I stitched together a quick mock-up of what it could look like. Now, I made this in Paint, literally in a minute to 2 minutes, just to kind of attach to the email very quickly. You'd see the ruler, you'd see an icon of the actual icon of the good in question, the amount, the effect, and a little message attached. I think it could go a long way in just adding a bit of personality and making it a lot easier to read. Even if you were just to get through this message very quickly, at least you've got the icon there. You know, you don't even have the icon normally. So it's like, boom, grain. I know what that looks like because I've seen it a million times. Anyway, that is the UI. It's cumbersome, it's antiquated, it's almost identical in some regards to EU Rome, and I just don't think the team realizes how important these things are to add a bit of immersion to the game, as well as provide easy access to information and not turn off newcomers to the franchise. I'm not asking for the game to be dumbed down, I'm just asking for it to look a little nicer. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is AI. The AI is extremely passive and it's very easy to beat. It's rare that big empires form, and when they do, they often collapse in on themselves due to civil war. They almost never wage war on you, and even on the hardest difficulties, they are just a pushover. Now, I'm not really that good at these games. I struggle on harder difficulties in Stellaris, and EU Rome constantly kicked my ass. But in this game, I can play pretty much any nation on very hard and do fine because the AI is just so passive. It's not even that they're bad, they're just passive. Now, you can fabricate a claim on someone, insult them, deploy troops at their borders and get ready for an invasion, and they just sit there with no idea. Then you wage war and you see that they've changed their economy to start suddenly paying their troops, and you can just kind of start stack wiping them out because they don't have any morale ready. It's like, come on, like anyone would know what's going on. I've got a claim, I've insulted you, I'm on your border, my troops are being paid, which you can also see. So it's like, why aren't you getting ready? Why are you even on the border? You shouldn't be on the border. Sit back, get further in, and be safe for a couple turns. Don't stand in front of your forts, you know? Anyway, I have seen them do really cool stuff though. Allies of mine have sent troops across the sea to join me in wars with very limited amounts of ships, so they'd end up making multiple journeys, which I was really impressed by. And they do well to stick with you if you allow them. So I think generally speaking, the long-term planning and threat assessment AI is severely lacking, but the moment-to-moment army AI is pretty good. As an example of the kind of long-term planning AI, you can see when they choose their ideas, you'll often find landlocked nations or nations without the access to wood specking their governments for building ships and stuff. It's like, well, you literally can't. You literally can't, and you're landlocked. What are you doing? So that will just kind of give you an idea of like what's really going on. Now, diplomacy itself is fine, but it's missing some much needed options when it comes to vassals. I think is probably my biggest problem with it. So you can't support them in a war if you want to break away from their master. They also can't break away from their master if their master is fighting a war, for the first 3 years anyway. So a horrible trick you can do is you can start integrating your vassals and just make sure that you're in a war with someone else and they just won't be able to wage a war with you and break away. So you can just integrate them and they literally cannot do anything because of the game mechanics. So it could even take 10 years. If you just keep your little wars going, they can't get away. This is really broken. So that's really all the time I have for this review. Essentially, though it all sounds pretty damning, I did play this game a lot because I enjoyed it. I wasn't forced to, and I'd be lying if I didn't say that I'm going to keep playing it, because at least for a while. So people will say this is a good foundation to be built on, but this isn't an early access game, it's not a live service game. It should be good from the beginning. There's no doubt in my mind that this is a mediocre game at best. It'll probably get better, but some aspects probably will never change. So, if you're new to Paradox games and you like Roman history, I do actually recommend it. You won't feel like you're missing too much stuff because you haven't played the other games. You will probably need a guide to help you out, but I think you'll get some good campaigns in. I mean, I did. Now, the game is definitely fun to try out, at least as each government type and maybe a few of the most famous countries before you start to see the repetition occur. If you're a familiar Paradox player or a veteran of the series, I'd probably hold off if you haven't made up your mind already, unless you really love the era as well. But personally, even then, I'd just wait for the first major patch to arrive, and maybe even the first expansion later down the line. Yoan, the game director, has said that they plan on delivering big free updates to improve mechanics and features alongside large content expansions. Now that sounds good to me. I know people rip on them for their DLC, rightfully so probably, but the Stellaris model is really good, and it looks like that's what they're doing here, rather than the EU4 model, which is not good. If they start making DLC for stuff that's clearly lacking in the game, I'll never touch this game again. Also, if people are wondering, you should not buy the deluxe edition. It is completely not worth it for the price. You get an Epirus kind of cosmetic and event pack, you get some wallpapers and some forum icons. You don't get the soundtrack or anything like that. A great way to get it is if you want to get the game and you want to get it 30% off that normal price, as well as getting the Epirus pack that's usually only in the deluxe edition, so an even bigger saving. You can get it by using my CD keys link. It'll be in the description. It's £25 sterling. I mean, for that price, game's not half bad. So yeah, that's it for the review. Kind of disappointing. I was rooting for this game, obviously, but as I said at the beginning, doesn't do any one thing particularly well, but it does do a lot of things, and modding seems quite powerful, so I guess time will tell. Thank you very much for watching. If you want to see more Imperator videos from me, let me know in the comments.